I think I have a problem.
Hey everyone, it's me, Owen. Just got back from still wearing my sunglasses from last episode because I can't remember my lines, and from redecorating my workspace because some people told me it was too visually cluttered. Hope that solves the problem. Today, I've got a question for you. What is a flag? That might seem like a question with an obvious answer to it, though the answer might vary in how complicated it is depending on how knowledgeable you are in the field of vexillology, that is, the study of flags. The layman's answer would probably be that it's a piece of cloth or similar material with shapes, symbols, colors, and sometimes words to represent something, be that a political entity or movement, an ethnic or cultural group, or just something like a sports team. Whitney Smith, one of the most important figures of modern vexillology, who both coined that very term and helped to establish several of the most well-known organizations in the field today, described a flag as the intentional combination of colors and shapes in a symbol, usually manifested on a piece of cloth or other flexible material, created to serve as a political or social communication between the user or users and one or more other individuals. And these are both fine definitions for what they are. Debates over what exactly the definition of a flag, and by extension the definition and bounds of vexillology as a study should be, have been raging for likely as long as the study has existed, and there are no signs of a sudden consensus being found anytime soon. But something I particularly love about Smith's definition that I don't always see elsewhere is that last bit. Created to serve as a political or social communication between the user or users and one or more other individuals. Because when it comes down to it, that's the critical piece here. If you're flying a flag outside and no one can recognize, relate to, or understand what it means and represents, then it serves very little purpose. Flags and the symbols they derived from, like vexilloids, that is, flag-like objects, or heraldry, were fundamentally used for identification and communication. Something for a group to rally around or to differentiate your side from the other. And in large part, even though we don't need flags anymore to figure out, say, who's who in a war and whose boat that is sailing into your harbor, these purposes have stayed the same. Because flags have had such an important place in our culture and politics for so long, they've come to also take on a fair amount of much more abstract meaning. Let's take, for example, Mario. Yes, that Mario. At the end of each level of the original 1985 Super Mario Bros., two flags appear, being this one, the one lowered from the flagpole Mario jumps on to complete the level, and this one, raised in the castle that he enters to continue his journey. These are some of the earliest depictions of flags in a game, but they aren't used in the way that earlier basic definition describes. When you see this flag lowered, you don't really think of it as Bowser's flag or something representing his regime. Sure, it's got a symbol there, but it's a little abstract, even generic. A skull isn't really meaningful or unique symbolism. And when you see this flag raised, you don't immediately think, of course, the flag of the sovereign state of the Mushroom Kingdom, because these flags represent something much more abstract than political entities. They represent, respectively, the conquering of evil and the victory of good. They are a visual shorthand for conquest. The level's challenges have been beaten, the enemies have been bested, and, as a final representation of your victory, you lower the flag of the defeated and raise your own. It doesn't matter what's on the flags, it's the action that's important. This example is a reminder of just how ingrained flags are into our collective understanding of politics and conflict, that even with heavily abstract symbolism, they can be used to easily convey ideas as complex as the usurping of one ruler and their replacement with another. And that's where we come to the obsession I've had for over the last year. The Legend of Zelda series is known by many for its intricate and often entirely nonsensical world building that leads people to meticulously comb through its entries for details that might connect one game to another, using minuscule background elements from decorative frescoes to random props and map elements to single lines of side character dialogue to construct elaborate theories about the nature of the world that these games take place in. And honestly, telling a story about the people who devote themselves to extensive, almost scholarship and historiography of fictional worlds could be an entire video of its own. But I've actually carved out my own tiny area of study in this strange field, being the flags of the Zelda series. My interest in this subject began to take hold in late 2019 as I was playing the 2017 title Breath of the Wild. I had already been interested in flags for some time at that point, but I wasn't so much interested in them in an academic way as I was in making them and looking at them. But as I was wandering around that game's version of Gyarados Town, something caught my eye. This. It's pretty innocuous looking, to be honest. It is a background detail after all, just something a developer put in to break up the monochrome walls of the city. But also, of course, it's a flag. And that piqued my interest. If I looked closer, just how many more could I find? The answer is a lot. In that game alone, that area alone. Because when you're looking for them, you will find flags absolutely everywhere in Zelda. Obviously, recent entries contain the most, just by nature of their being so much bigger than their predecessors. Breath of the Wild's flags can be found from the desert to the snowy mountains, almost anywhere you look. For the Gyarados, they usually take earth tones and are square or feather-shaped, with banners found in their central city. They feature a number of charges, that is, the main symbol on a flag, usually the primary symbol of the Gyarados people or abstract designs, but occasionally other symbols like depictions of the divine beast Vaunaboris will show up. These flags, apart from those in Gyarados Town, are quite simple and look like they could be handmade with relative ease. Their presence inside of some houses would seem to support this. The flags of the Gyarados, like those of most other non-Hyrulean groups, are primarily used to represent political division of land, to indicate to the audience whose territory they're on. This is done both through use of symbols that are associated with the group, and through colors and patterns that communicate the information by playing into the aesthetics of the group they represent, aesthetics often informed by the cultural coding of the group. Similar to this purpose, though not exactly the same, are flags like this one, which uses a depiction of currency to represent a shop. The flags of the Rito share patterns and colors seen in their clothing and other decorations. This is one of the reasons that Breath of the Wild's depictions of flags feel so real in a way that's sometimes difficult to explain. They draw heavily from the cultural language of the group they were made to represent. Something that, intentionally or not, Zelda seems to understand very well is that flags always exist in a very particular political and cultural context. Nearly everyone depicted is an entirely different shape, because that's how flags have been for most of history in a lot of places. The popular conception of all flags being a rectangle roughly similar in that sense to all others is a very modern invention, and one that even still isn't ubiquitous. And this is combined with the incorporation of patterns, colors, and other elements that communicate more subtly to the player who any given flag represents. This is demonstrated nowhere better than in the aesthetic divide between the Kingdom of Hyrule proper and the broader culture of the Hylian people. When you look at the flags representing the kingdom itself, you can immediately tell that they represent an incredibly powerful institution. The colors used in them are different and far more rich than those seen almost anywhere else in the game, and they're often displayed in a way that transforms them from just being a means of identification to a projection and representation of power. And in the post-apocalyptic world of Breath of the Wild, they serve the additional purpose of communicating details of the world to the player, showing them the extent of the kingdom that once ruled over the region, but being tattered and faded to show how much that power has since decayed. However, Hyrule and the Hylian people aren't one and the same, and nowhere is that more evident than the flags seen outside of the central kingdom. These are much more similar to the flags of other groups in the game than they are to the kingdom, being much more abstract, at least to the audience, in symbolism and patterns, with a handmade but still complex and distinct quality. The 2011 title Skyward Sword has a fairly small number of flags relative to other entries, but that would follow from the fact that the game depicts the very beginning of Hylian civilization in a pre-Hyrulean period. The flags that are present are almost exclusively for the Hylians, which is reflected in this beautiful hand-painted pattern style that they have, something they share with clothing and other art. Since almost all of these flags appear strictly within the context of the one Hylian settlement in the game, they serve less of a purpose of identifying whose territory you're in and more of one in fleshing out the environment and cultural world building. That said though, the game does feature a handful of flags that do have clear charges, all of which feature the logo of the Knights Academy, which makes sense since those do help with the player's spatial awareness, identifying easily what buildings are associated with the academy. But even these ones aren't just a charge on a bedsheet, they too feature intricate patterns and decorations framing the central crest. Again, the game doesn't really feature any civilizations that the game deems developed or centralized enough to warrant flags, but that doesn't mean there aren't others, we'll just have to look elsewhere. Notably, the game's concept art features several that we'll never get to see in the actual game. This early Magma Leader concept art actually has this person holding one, but it's difficult to make out what it's supposed to be and there's no explanation. And there are actually two cut flags from the game's Lanayru region, the first of which is this one that would have gone on the top of the masts of the Sandship dungeon, and this absolutely massive one that would have gone on the entrance to the Pirate Stronghold mini dungeon. This is genuinely such a cool concept, and between these two cuts, I'm convinced that Lanayru is the land of dead dreams, for me at least. Also, no, there is no flag for Groosland, and I'm just as disappointed as you are. 2009 Spirit Tracks also only features a handful of flags, but the few it does have are used to great effect in the game's world building. They're really only found in one place of the game, being Hyrule Castle, so naturally they reflect the style of regal and colorful flags typical of other iterations of that location. But because this game doesn't actually take place in the same Hyrule as previous games, rather New Hyrule, the symbolism used is markedly different. Fun fact there, it's actually reminiscent of a pirate symbol because the pirate crew was among the initial founders of New Hyrule. Even though the symbolism is different, however, the flags use the same visual cues as other flags meant to convey the same ideas of power and royalty, such as bright reds, blues, and golds, but make the distinction between this institution and others clear through the use of a highly unique charge. Twilight Princess, released in 2006, is an absolute treasure trove of incredible flags, the first of which can be seen immediately after exiting your home in the first scene of the game. It's constructed the same as others seen on houses in the village, made of cloth of a single color featuring some charge, be that a leaf, rose, or a more abstract symbol, with a feature we haven't seen much of yet, being fringe maybe made of grass, partially dyed sometimes, coming from the bottom. Though in the case of one flag, this fringe is substituted by lace, a much less conventional sight on flags. Since these flags appear almost exclusively decorating the houses in Link's hometown, Orden Village, they can be inferred to represent the individual or family that lives there. As a result, this is actually the closest thing to a flag for Link that we get to see in the series, and the symbol on it could almost be considered a symbol of him, though it does appear in other places, notably the Orden Shield. It is unique to the village though, at very least making it a regional one. These flags are excellent at communicating the earlier touched on idea of cultural language, both reflecting and telling us about the group they were made by. Here, the inclusion of natural symbolism and construction elements, as well as something you don't hear about so much in vexillological discourse being the method of display, with these flags being often hung from decorative depictions of Orden goat horns, tell us about the rural agricultural culture of the region. But there's actually another kind of flag in the village, which tells us something very different but just as interesting. These can be found around the outside of the town mayor's house and within the shrine on the inside. Now, if you've been listening closely so far, you'll know what these bright red and gold colors mean. Standing in stark contrast to the other flags of Orden, these are distinctly Hyrulean colors, and even if the symbolism is a bit abstract, things that look a bit like this charge do appear elsewhere, all associated with the kingdom, but as far as I can tell, this is the only place it appears in this form. It's immediately clear what they're meant to represent. But you might be thinking I'm stretching here. After all, why would Hyrulean flags be found so far outside of the kingdom itself? Well, if you're familiar with Twilight Princess, you might already know the answer. One of the first plot points in the game involves a sword made in Ordon being sent by the mayor to the princess as a gift, with Link being the one to carry it on that mission. So it's clear through that the mayor pays direct tribute to Hyrule and is likely given his power and legitimacy by its ruler. So it actually kind of makes sense that this would be reflected in these flags. And that's such a tiny, insignificant detail about the lore of a 2006 Wii game that no one cares about anymore. But I care about it, and it perfectly sums up what's so fascinating about these flags to me, that they can contain so much significance and meaning that pretty much every single player won't even see, much less think about. Another thing Twilight Princess has that we see almost nowhere else is an actual Vexilloid, carried by the mini-boss King Balblin on his first fight. The child, isn't part of it. This big, whatever it is, I'm pretty sure it's made of hair or something roughly analogous, but it's incredible and I love it. It's so simple and effective, and it's also really just quite pretty. But it's also interesting in some less superficial ways. Pretty clearly it exists, at least partially for gameplay purposes. King Balblin holds it during a big battle where you're riding around in a field chasing him on horseback, with a bunch of his minions trying to get in your way. This object's main purpose is just to guide you to your objectives, so hopefully it's always clear who you're going after. But, you might be wondering, but probably aren't, why not just use a flag? If the main goal is just guiding a player to follow someone, why wouldn't a big red flag do the trick? Especially since everyone else uses flags already anyway. Well, I would argue it's because it subtly otherizes King Balblin from the Hylians, who the player is meant to relate with. In part, it separates him from our modern conceptions of legitimate statehood, which most of the time includes the idea of some sort of semi-traditional flag, which exists to represent it. The use of a Vexilloid serves primarily, I would argue, to tap into some subtle conceptions that the player has. Historically, this kind of Vexilloid constructed with hair has been typical of Central and Southwest Asia, notably with the peoples of what is now Iran, Turkey, and Mongolia. These groups, or groups that are coded to resemble them, are often depicted as being malicious invading forces in especially fantasy media, particularly in Europe, who has a long history of conflict with all of these groups, though Japan is also not unfamiliar with particularly the third of those three. The choice to use these kinds of subtle cultural references is not without purpose, and it should be noted, not without politics. Other than Ordon Village, the next largest concentration of flags in Twilight Princess is easily that game's version of Hyrule Castle and the town surrounding it. On the outside, these take the by now familiar route for Hyrulean flag design, using bright reds, golds, and whites to provide stark contrast to the game's usually relatively muted color palette. The fringe on the ones in the town center is a particularly nice touch. However, inside of the walls of the castle itself, we're treated to some different designs and purposes. This one, while not interesting in design, being a very standard pennant with only the Hyrulean crest to decorate it, has a very interesting moment in the manga's adaptation of the game, when Midna uses it to identify where her and Link were after they had both been captured and imprisoned in the castle dungeon. I can't really articulate why, but I really like this particular page. It's a very nice use of a flag to convey information in a more interesting way than just exposition. 2002's The Wind Waker is also home to an excellent vexillological collection. Considering that flags, as a necessary part of modern statehood, arose largely from trade with ships and particularly European mercantilism, it makes a lot of sense that a game all about sailing would feature more than a handful, and even more sense that a lot of those are associated with a side quest that involved you traveling the sea to trade items. In Zunari's trading quest, there were 3 flags you can... In Zunari's trading quest, there are 3 flags you can acquire, being the Sickle Moon flag, the Big Catch flag, and the Hero's flag. The Hero's flag is the simplest of the 3, being a pennant with 2 bands along the edge and with this fun sword emblem in the hoist, that is, the side of the flag closest to the pole. To really reinforce that warrior concept, it's also flown from a spear. The Big Catch flag is a little less traditional to Western vexillological eyes with its complicated, colorful image and fringe, but will be immediately recognizable to Japanese fishermen as a traditional flag in their profession. Keeping with the theme of unique poles, this one uses a trident, which is cute. And finally, where normalcy is thrown out of the window, we get the Sickle Moon flag. And I gotta say, I absolutely adore this flag. From the incredibly unique shape, to the bright colors, to the symbolism, to the incorporation of really unusual elements like those additional ribbons or these little ornaments on the tips of the flag, it's just beautifully natural and genuine feeling in a way I've never really seen in another game before. It feels like a real flag from a real culture, and the incredible thing? We don't even have any idea what that culture is. There's no group in the game that it belongs to which it can draw aesthetics from, like Breath of the Wild's flags. It feels natural because it was made in a way that understands the non-uniformity of flags, and how amazing that is. Being confined to a certain set of colors and symbols on a perfectly proportional rectangle is a box a lot of people put themselves into today, and when thinking about modern movements or countries, sure, maybe that's a reasonable place to start. But we lose so much when we see it as the default of all contexts. A similar flag is seen representing the Rito on Dragon Roost Island, and while it uses a much more traditional form, it also uses this incredible symbolism on it, which is great, even though as the player we're never really told what it means. Another flag I'm really in love with is this, seen outside of Hyrule Castle, and it's easily the most modern flag of the entire series. Clearly inspired by the Nordic cross flags of Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland, it's got a unique twist of this part of the cross being split in 2 lines, and of course a Triforce at the intersection of the cross. It's a great design, though don't ask me why they use cross symbolism in a world where no one practices Christianity. Though, to be fair, there is this old artwork of Link literally praying to Jesus, so it's not without precedent, I guess. The final point of note in this game is that there are 2 different pirate flags depicted, being this very standard one for Tetra's crew, pictured in Super Smash Bros. Brawl. This symbol is notably different from that of New Hyrule, the latter of which actually includes what appears to be a crude depiction of the King of Red Lions, and this one for Ganon's forces in the Forsaken Fortress. It's a bit open to interpretation what this is. Is it a skull? Maybe, though it's a stretch. Is it a nose? Maybe of the Bokoblins or Moblins? Also maybe, and potentially more likely, though that's kind of strange symbolism. Regardless, it's there, so I had to mention it even if I have no idea what it means. The turn of the millennium in 2000 saw the release of Majora's Mask, and while the N64 version was far too blurry and undetailed to feature very many identifiable flags, there were a few, and there were even more and more clear versions of those that already existed in the game's 2015 3D re-release. Starting with one of the best, there's this one that hangs over the office of the mayor of Clocktown, and it's just perfection. It's most likely my favorite in the whole series. I genuinely hang up a full version of this on my wall. The symbolism of the clock is so perfect for the well-named town, and it's clear what it is even though it's simplified. The color choice is excellent and it contrasts well, and why isn't this used in more places? The average player probably won't see it at all since it's so high up, which is a serious shame because it really is nice to look at. Please join the Flag Above the Mayor's Office and Majora's Mask awareness campaign today. For just 5 cents, you can fund me hiring a plane to drop leaflets on every major city on the eastern seaboard. Also in Clocktown, the Treasure Shop minigame happens to have its own flag. This is a weird one, and the symbolism is pretty straightforward, but I thought I should mention it. Majora's Mask is one of the few games in the series where Gorons actually have any flags representing them. In most games they're hot dudes TM, and the flags would probably catch on fire, but in Majora's Mask their town has been frozen over, making them cool dudes TM, a necessary prerequisite for and result of having a bunch of flags. The few varieties that appear are all very standard, only featuring the symbol of the Gorons and color, but since it's relatively rare, it's worth pointing out. Now, I have no idea how the pirates in the Wind Waker messed this up so badly, but Majora's Mask's pirates are ahead of the flag game by miles. There's this one, which is heavily reminiscent of the Gyarados symbol, but its own interesting take on it. There's this patterned one with an excellent symbol of these swords being crossed, but with the unusual addition of hands. And lastly, more patterns, but also a very nice and unusually colorful skull. These last two being just more examples of that cultural language world building we've been talking about all episode. And lastly, in terms of notable flags in the game, we come to the Akana Valley, which features two in the throne room of the ancient castle of Akana. This one with a circle and three upturned crescents, and this more abstract one, which I think is maybe a bird based on some similar, though less stylized depictions on castle walls. Note the color palette used here, obviously similar to that usually reserved for Hyrule. 1998's Ocarina of Time underwent roughly the same process as its sequel, Majora's Mask, originally releasing on hardware that didn't allow for incredibly detailed textures and later receiving a 3D remake, this one in 2010, which brought all of those juicy flag details into clearer focus. This is interestingly one of the only games to feature multiple flags for Hyrule but not use red on any of them. There's this one that flags on the walls of the castle, affixed to an admittedly pretty rough looking post, which is blue with two white stripes running the length of it, and this one in Zelda's courtyard, which is also blue but with more signature gold decoration and a depiction of the Triforce. Though it's definitely a stretch, it is interesting that the 3D game, in which Hyrule is the least powerful and extensive, uses the much more calming color of blue in its flags, whereas subsequent entries use a much more adversarial red. The Gorons also have flags in this game, the same as the most basic ones seen in Majora's Mask, but for some reason in the remake, the Goron symbols were replaced by Triforces. This was pointed out to me by a research contributor, but neither of us can really find a reason for it. Finally, the Gyarados use this plain red flag nearly everywhere, though it seems like it's much less for identification. It's incredibly simple after all, and more for direction, using the color as a guide in the desert. But with Ocarina covered, we've actually hit an interesting point. Prior to 1998 and Zelda having 3D graphics, the trail kind of runs cold. There are basically no flags to be found whatsoever. If we want to get really technical here, the 2019 remake of Link's Awakening, which originally released in 1993, has one, but it's a completely original addition to the remake that wasn't there in any sense in the original, so I don't really think it counts. Even then though, we are left with one flag. This one from 1992's A Link to the Past on the first floor of Hyrule Castle. It's pretty abstract with no super clear symbolism, but even then it's really interesting. Even all that time ago, you can see the colors that would come to be so closely associated with the kingdom even all those years later. Even in this hyper-pixelized form, you can tell what it's for. And for a flag, then I think it's done its job. That's it, the first Zelda flag. Well, kinda. See, I've been researching this stuff for a while, and for pretty much the entire time, I was fairly certain that this was the first one. And if we're talking about flags that have appeared in-game, then I was right, at least as far as I can tell. So it is the first flag in a Zelda game, but it might not be the first Zelda flag. It's a little difficult to tell here exactly which of these came first, since they kind of happened at the same time, but I like to consider this next one to be the real first one. So where is it? Well, it's right here. Need me to zoom in a bit? There. It's blurry, uncolored, it's hard to even see it, much less discern what's on it, but it's undeniably there. This is a piece of artwork by Katsuya Terada, produced for the A Link to the Past's player guide in 1992, the same year the game came out. Even though it's simplistic in places, this is an absolutely beautiful piece of art. And the reason that I consider this to be the first Zelda flag, or at very least perhaps the one of most significance, is connected to the significance of the piece as a whole. See, back in 1992, video games just didn't look like this. They looked like this, and this was what was cutting edge. So as a player, you didn't know exactly what every part of the world was supposed to look like, and you had to put some imagination into that. But oftentimes, game developers or publishers would help you along with that a little bit, and showed what the game was supposed to be representing. This was most visibly done through box art, but there were other places that this happened which are less well discussed today, from illustrations in game manuals to those in magazines and player's guides like this one. For many games, these illustrations would go on to heavily shape the aesthetics of a series for many years to come, and this was very much true for Zelda. If you're a longtime fan, you'll clearly see the influences from even just one image like this. And there, since the beginning of the series' world building, is that simple background detail, a flag. It's not doing anything, it's not the focal point, it's barely even visible. But as we've discussed, its presence can say just as much as anything it might display. Do I think that any of the people making these games have ever put anywhere near this amount of thought into the subject? No, I really don't. They probably don't care about it at all, and that's fine. Remember that first definition we talked about today, that a flag is created to serve as a political or social communication between the user or users and one or more other individuals. Those artists went through the work of making the things. That's all I need them to do. The message has been sent. All I have to do then is sit here and try to figure out what it means to me.
Hey everyone, it's me. I am editing this video right now. That's why my mic quality is awful, and I just wanted to jump here in here at the end and say a couple of things. First of all, this video would not have been possible at all in the way it was without the help of a bunch of different people who provided screenshots and research for this project. You can find their names listed in the description below. If you are interested in contributing to this project, because it is ongoing, there is also a link to the Zelda Flags Discord in that description, so go check it out. It should not expire, so no matter when you're viewing this video, that link should still work for you. And the third thing I have is all of you need to go follow me on Twitter in order to validate me. But also because I post channel updates and little teasers and updates on upcoming videos, so if you want to stay up to date about what I'm doing and also be subjected to my shitposts, that is the place to go. Alright, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all later. Bye!